And this morning, we are delighted to have as a guest speaker, Dr. David Willis. Dr. Willis began his studies in Oxford with a master's degree in Russian and German in 1991 to later complete a second master's at the same place in general linguistics, 1993, and 3 years later, obtaining his PhD on word order in the history of Welsh in 1996. Dr. Willis is currently a professor of Celtic in the Jesus College of the University of Oxford in England, and his work includes specialization in historical linguistics and in theoretical and dialect syntax, working primarily on material from Celtic languages. His interests are in the mechanisms of syntactic variation and change, syntactic reconstruction, and in the use of electronic corpora in historical linguistics. His most new projects include historical corpus of the Welsh language, the syntactic atlas of Welsh dialects, the history of negation in the languages of European and the Mediterranean, and Dr. Willis has recently begun a project to map dialect variation using social media data. So without further introduction, everyone, please welcome Dr. David Willis.
Great, thank you very much. So as you said, I've been working recently on a project looking at using social media data, for which read Twitter, to map syntactic variation and change in various languages. It's aspects of that I'm going to talk to you about today, specifically the subset of that is to do with Celtic, obviously, specifically Welsh. So, oops. There we go. Sorry. So let me start by introducing the project to you, and then I will talk about some general issues, and then we'll get down to looking at a couple of case studies from the Welsh data. So this is an ESC-funded project jointly with, well, originally it was Cambridge Lancaster, but it's now Oxford Bern, in fact, Oxford Cambridge Bern, and I'm working with Adrian Lehman in Bern, Tam Blackster, Deepti Gopal, and Jonathan Mackenzie in Cambridge, and they are responsible for some of the data that we'll be looking at today. The overall pattern, the overall project officially at least looks at 3 languages. It originally looked at 3 languages, namely British and Irish English, Welsh, and originally Norwegian, extended to mainland Scandinavian, although we've also been looking to a certain extent at Turkish and a couple of other languages. I'm going to be focusing though today on Welsh, as I said, and the idea is to use corpora of Twitter messages to map syntactic variation. Now, we're not the first to do this. There's a strong tradition of doing this on a large scale in particular. So there's a lot of work doing this on what you might call massive languages. So American English, World Spanish. And a lot of that work is on a very big scale. And of course, when you're working with a language like Welsh, you're not working on a big scale. You're working on a very, very small scale, as is the case with all of the Celtic languages. So one of the point of interest of using Welsh for the project is to see if we can do this type of work for smaller languages to map small scale micro variation or less frequent morphosyntactic patterns. It's also true that the tradition of working on big languages has tended to look at things which are really, really frequent, often lexical variation. And we, like a lot of people working on Celtic languages and a lot of people working in syntax, have slightly different focus, and maybe we need to do things slightly differently because of that. I should actually say, in the end, it's turned out that Welsh has been rather easier to work with than English, but that wasn't obvious from the start. So, right, what have we been doing with Welsh? Well, of course, you all know the sociolinguistic situation of Welsh, just over 500,000 speakers within Wales and maybe a further 120,000 elsewhere. They also tweet, so bear in mind they can also be in the corpus. We've been collecting tweets in Welsh since October 2017. In fact, we're still collecting them as long as the computer in the office is still working, which isn't a guaranteed. But by January 2019, we had about 1 million tweets in Welsh. That's 18 million words from 47,000 accounts. The data I'm talking about today is that plus a bit more. It goes up to December 2019, although we could add more data to it if we wanted to or needed to. There's quite a lot of data, and it's enough that handling it manually is difficult, but it's not so large that it works the way that that American English or even British and Irish English works, namely those languages where there's so much data that, well, what I've put there is it's invariant under error. It doesn't much matter if some of the data is wrong, because the noise disappears in the data, and we'll see noise as an issue a bit later on. Now, the method to link this corpus, so this is a corpus, you could just use it as a corpus, but the method to link this to geography is a specific method that we've developed involving keyword localization. That is, we have an algorithm that maps user accounts to best guesses for the origin of the speaker, writer, based on keywords within the entirety of the data that account produces. So that includes the user location field, the user biography, and the text of the tweets themselves. The algorithm looks for place names. Additionally, informal names for places and names of regions, weighted by number of occurrences of those and the context in which they are used. So if in your bio you say born and bred in X, it gives that a high weight. If you just happen to mention the place in a tweet, that gets a low weight. We've also been trying to use pattern networks of followers to enhance this. For instance, following local organizations, following local sports teams, following local services, also gets you points. Okay, so what do we get out of this? So this is a simple toy example, and I'll come on to more complex ones. So this is a lexical example to show you how it all works. So this is the data for the word for today in the Welsh data. So you're going to get a pair of maps each time. On the left is the raw data. And so you can see that there are two options for the word for today. It's either heddiw, in the red corner, it's heddi, and in the blue, it's heddiw. So historically, heddiw is the older form, and the final vowel is dropped in southern varieties. In the top right-hand corner of the screen, you can see that this was asked in the Welsh Dialects Survey, which was conducted in the 1990s. And that's a traditional dialect survey. You go to a place and you ask one person at each place. The speakers used there were born in the 1920s. And you see in the top right quite a clear north-south divide. This is a classic pattern in Welsh dialectology. There's a straight line across the middle of Wales, and to the north you have heddiw, and to the south you have heddi. What do we find in the Twitter data? Well, the heddiw form, of course, is the standard written form. So it's not a surprise that the standard written form is found throughout Wales, and it's in fact the majority form almost everywhere. But you see that we get the same broad pattern, that there's a fair amount of red in the south and not much red in the north. So we're only really finding the heddi pattern, the heddi variant in the south. On the right, you'll see a second map, This is the smoothed data map. So this applies a smoothing operation, and the circles represent points at which there is data, and obviously the darker the red, the higher the smoothed frequency of heavy at that point, and that makes it a bit clearer to see what the patterns are on the left. And you see that the north-south divide comes out pretty clearly. But you also get another pattern emerging, and we'll sort of see this, hints of this elsewhere as well, a kind of an east-west pattern in the south, where you see that the traditional dialect variant, heavy, is maintained much better in the west than in the east. That's something we can attribute to language revitalization. So a lot of the points in the east, both in the northeast and in the southeast, are in areas where Welsh has died out as a traditional language, and is dependent there on the emergence of new communities, and also on revitalization efforts through the education system. And these, certainly the second of those two factors, tends to promote standard variants. And we see that here quite clearly, and we'll see it again in some of the other examples. So I'm going to move on now to, we're going to look at three case studies using the Twitter data. The first of these involves the second person singular pronoun, subject pronoun, well, second person singular pronoun rather than subject pronoun, sorry, which can be either T, under some circumstances also D, or D. And I'll give you a bit of background before looking at the data. So first of all, the overall distribution. If you look at the top right of the slide, you'll see the Welsh Dialects Survey again, and that shows you that the option throughout most of Wales is T in the blue. There's this variant Chdi, which is in the northwest corner, basically. And they also found a third variant, Chdi, which I'll talk about in a second, in a couple of places. It's a complete relic. And we didn't find it in Twitter, by the way. That's the broad pattern that we're interested in. But in the Welsh Dialects Survey, they just asked basically, what is your word for you? And they didn't pay any attention to syntactic context. And it turns out syntactic context is crucial for looking at this. So we're gonna look at a lot more at syntactic context. Now, the background to this is that Welsh doesn't have a case system for pronouns, but it does have two, has a number of series of pronouns, but the ones we're interested in seem to exemplify a strong versus weak pronominal distinction. And this is clearest, well, in fact, it's only clear in the singular. It's not at all clear in the plural. So there's the form of V for I, me, which is the strong form, and E, which is the weak form. And in the third person masculine singular in the north, there's vor, which is the strong form, and or, which is the weak form. The difference between these two forms is that strong forms are used in context not associated with agreement, while the weak forms are found in contexts that do show agreement. So the weak forms are, for instance, the subject of verbs that show agreeing forms. They're also used as the object of prepositions that show agreeing forms. Conversely, the strong forms are used in focus position or after a preposition that does not inflect. Okay, so I've said all that. So very quickly, the historical background, as I've implied, chdi is the innovation and t goes back to Middle Welsh. And it's clear that chdi arose via one particular syntactic context from one particular collocation, namely after a handful of uninflecting prepositions, such as a, with, and these are all contexts for aspirate mutation. And so there was a strong reduplicated form of the pronouns. For the second person singular, this was tadi, and after these uninflecting prepositions, you got aspirate mutation, and tadi became thadi. So even in Middle Welsh, the correct expected form is for with you is a thadi. And then the phonology kicks in and you get loss of the unstressed schwa. So it goes from athd to athd. And that gets you this form that you remember we saw in the Welsh dialect survey in parts of the north. And then the shift phonologically to chdi is a dissimilation that seems to have happened perhaps in the mid 19th century. You don't find it up until then. That's the phonological story. There's also a syntactic story, namely that thdi and then chdi spreads from its original context, which is the object of this group of prepositions, initially spreads as a strong pronoun. So the object of these prepositions is a strong syntactic context anyway. So initially what happens is that thdi and then chdi spreads to other strong syntactic contexts. So for instance, use of the pronoun in isolation. And then later, I'll just move to the next slide, which gives you the historical narrative by date. You can see that the initial changes are found in the 18th and into the 19th century, but the second spread is beyond these strong contexts, and you start finding chdi in other syntactic environments, which not all of which would be thought of as strong. So some of these seem to be associated with agreement. And for our purposes today, we're looking at the object of the preposition e, for or to, which is not clear if that's an agreeing context or not, actually. There's a preposition that agrees with some pronouns but not others. So that's a relatively early context for it to spread to, and not surprising since it's semi-agreeing. And then it spreads to some other contexts which are fully agreeing. So the object of inflecting preposition and the subject of a finite auxiliary. And those are contexts where in some dialects today, you can find chdi. Now I've traced these in other work and shown that there's a kind of wave-like diffusion out from a central core zone of innovation in the Northwest, and that you can see that in some of the spoken corpora today, for instance, the siarad corpus of spoken Welsh. If you analyze that, you can see these patterns of wave-like diffusion. What that means is that in a core area in the Northwest, speakers use chdi in a large number of syntactic contexts, but then in a more peripheral area around that, it's used in fewer syntactic contexts. Specifically, it's more likely to be used in the ones which are strong, not associated with agreement. And I found similar patterns when I looked at questionnaire data for the Syntactic Atlas of Welsh Dialects project. So overall, all of that research gets a kind of a hierarchy of contexts, which is at the bottom there. And I'm going to look at a couple of those now in the Twitter data. So above all, you need to see that the uninflected prepositions are on the left. That's an old context for chdi. E2 is a bit later. It's a fairly old context for chdi. Then inflected prepositions. And then we skip to the right of the hierarchy where you see be, will, and gan, with or have. That's a late context. Those are two late contexts. They're contexts where chdi has only really arisen very recently. So what do we find in the Twitter data? So first up, uninflected prepositions. So recall the distribution in the syntactic atlas of Welsh dialects with this this northwest corner being the area for chdi, and in fact, this is something like the sort of context that they probably had in mind when they were asking informants. So if nothing's changed, this would be a prime context to get a similar pattern. And basically we do. If you look at the raw data on the left, you see the chdi in red is largely limited to this northwestern corner. We'll see a couple of other features of the data that are typical. So you'll see splashes of red all over the place, and there's just noise in the data. To some extent, this is students, but it's not entirely students. It's also just errors of localization. Some of them are just clearly errors of localization if you look them up. The localization is done automatically and we don't interfere with it. So you can just sometimes just see that that's what's happened. It's sometimes also people who've moved and it's not obvious that they've moved, but you can see if you read all of their tweets that they're not from the dialect area that they're currently living in. So that's also why it's often the larger localities that have the noise, partly because they're more likely to be places you'd move to. But if you disregard that noise, and that's what the smoothing algorithm is for, you eliminate chdi from the south. The more interesting case, and we'll see this again in a second, is what's happening in the northeast. You kind of see that the far northeast has more chdi in it than the intermediate area between the northeast and the northwest, and that might suggest a kind of a leapfrogging effect due to revitalization. And we'll get this again in some of the other contexts, because the areas with red in the northeast are basically areas where the traditional varieties have died out, and the Welsh there is revitalized Welsh. And what seems to happen is that the revitalization is influenced by varieties which are a long way to the west, rather than solely by varieties that are immediately adjacent. Okay, let's go on now to the next context. So this is after the preposition E. We've got a lot more data here. But again, a rather similar pattern. The Twitter data identifies the same correct northwestern region. Recall, this is a fairly early context for chdi to spread to, so it's not surprising that it should be in the whole of that area. And we get an even clearer case of the effect I was just talking about, that there's a gap between the northwest and then an area in the northeast where you do find chdi in reasonable quantities, not as much as in the northwest. And that seems to suggest a leapfrogging effect. And it's also an effect that I found in the questionnaire data in the Syntactic Atlas of Welsh Dialects. And when I looked at it then, I wasn't too sure whether it was just noise in the data. It may be noise in the data in both cases, but the fact that you find it through two independent means is at least suggestive that this is a real phenomenon. It's certainly something that will be useful to investigate on the ground. Next up, inflecting prepositions. Okay, there's quite a bit less data here, but it could be expanded. I just used the data for two prepositions here, am, for, and are, on. Again, rather similar patterns. Now, this is a context in which the area for chdi was found to be slightly less in the Syntactic Atlas of Welsh dialects. And what you do find in the Twitter data is that you get the full northwestern distribution of a slightly more contexts than you do in more traditional data. And I suspect this just means that the people producing the Twitter data are slightly younger. We have done some work on age, but it's been more used in the English data than only really used in the English data. But it's clear that the Twitter demographic is a bit younger than you would use if you were doing an interview-based study or a questionnaire-based study. So what that may mean is that in the demographic that we're looking at in Twitter data, the innovation has run to completion in the areas where it exists, and that seems to be the case here. Now, I'm going to move on now to look at two more contexts, but these are contexts which are very different. They're at the far right edge of the hierarchy. They're contexts where chdi has only arisen very recently. So the first of these is with the future auxiliary form of the verb to be. So be, so you get be chdi, or badachdi, or chdi. It's quite rare, but some people do it. And of course, it's also not a terribly common context. So you see a scattering of that on the left, and the smoothing doesn't come out so clearly on the smoothing because there's not really enough data. But this is very much in line with what we find in other sources of data that suggests that even in the core innovating area, this is a minority. It's a minority of speakers that are using chdi in this context. And the final context is with gan, and you can barely see the chdis here, but they do exist. There is an innovation there of using chdi after gan. So this forms like ganochdi. It's so little that it doesn't really show up in the smoothing at all. But you can see patches in the Northwest, and it is clear that there are some younger speakers in the Northwest who do this. That's another thing I could mention about the usefulness of using Twitter data. It's highlighting some relatively new forms. It's only in Twitter data that I've seen complete absence of agreement between prepositions and their pronominal objects, for instance, which is clearly a very recent innovation. Okay, so then to sum up on chdi, the first three contexts seem to run to more or less completion within the chdi region. The interesting contexts of Beath and gan. Other studies have correctly identified these as restricted contexts for chdi, and Twitter agrees. And we might ask why it should be that these are the latest contexts, or among the latest contexts. And I think there we have to return to our hypothesis initially about agreement. These are both contexts that require a reformation of the morphology of the item in question for them to really work with chdi. So before you get chdi with B, the speakers in question always adopt a new form of the auxiliary. So the traditional standard form is byddi on the left, but speakers who have chdi either change it to bydda, which means they're adopting the stem from all the non-third person singular forms, or they adopt the form B, the B dropping the eth, which is the stem in the third person singular. And you get a similar thing going on with gan. Traditional form is gen in the second person singular, but they always change it to gunnar before they use it with chdi. And then I've mentioned the evidence of leapfrogging. Okay, let's go on then to the second study. Now, for this one, I don't really have data from the current Twitter project, but I do have data from the pilot. So I'm going to show you that, because again, I think it raises some interesting questions about the nature of Twitter data and about the nature of revitalization. So this is auxiliary deletion, or actually technically it's actually deletion of the verb to be, whether it's an auxiliary or not. It's usually called auxiliary deletion. In context like one there, so you are going, well, it can be routine mynd with the full auxiliary rout, but you can also say tin mynd and various combinations in between that. That's been investigated by various people before. It's conditioned in quite complex ways, at the very least by person and number, and that conditioning is dialectically variant. So for instance, auxiliary deletion in the first person plural is common in the south, but rare in the north. I'm going to look at deletion in the second person singular, which seems to be the most favorable context for it, and it's found in all dialects. The effect of clause type has also been investigated, but not to any clear conclusions. You might think that this was an effect of being in clause initial position. That's not though the case. You can get deletion in main clauses when the verb to be is not the first word of the sentence. For instance, in WH questions, it's very common, and you can get it in embedded clauses, where obviously it's not the first word of the sentence. So just the background to this, the various studies, previous studies have shown that auxiliary deletion is extremely common in natural speech. So Davis and Duca 2014 find 93% deletion in the shad corpus in the second person singular, which is the one I'm going to look at, and not a great deal of age variation either. Even the oldest speakers do it very, very frequently, and even some speakers born in the 1920s have used close to 100%. So it's not a particularly recent innovation, although people feel that it is. And people have argued about whether it's internally motivated or due to contact with English, and I won't really talk about that any further. I've looked at it in the 19th century. You do get examples of it in the Welsh translations of Uncle Tom's Cabin, where it's used to represent second language Welsh, which is one possible argument that it's due to contact with English. But there are other arguments in the opposite direction. Now, let's look at then the data. So red is deletion and blue is retention. So you'll see in the Twitter data, we get the same high levels of deletion that are found in spoken corpora. So that's nice as a test of whether the Twitter data is close to speech, and it seems to be relatively close, although not identical. The rates of deletion in the Twitter data are in the 70%, 75%, something like that. 75 to 80% in, that's a bit lower than the 90% in natural speech. The other thing to note, so it's a relatively good proxy for spoken data. The other thing to note is and it's clearest on the smooth distribution, where I've set the levels to bring it out, right? So the white areas don't mean areas where this doesn't happen. It means areas where it's below 70%. So it's the majority everywhere, but it's more of a majority in the Northwest as opposed to the Northeast. And then in the South, you get the similar effect where it's levels are a bit lower, but it's more of a majority in the West than in the East again. And again, this might be a link to revitalization and standardization. Obviously, this is regarded as a non-standard feature, despite the fact that native speakers seem to do it almost all the time. And therefore, not, at the very least, not promoted by the education system. And we see correspondingly that in the areas where Welsh is most supported by the education system, we find the lowest areas, the lowest levels of auxiliary deletion. Okay, right. Then finally, the third, so I should say case study 3, the third thing I want to look at is the variation in the embedded focus complementizer. So this is the marker that you use in Welsh in an embedded clause if you fronted something for contrastive focus. So as an example there, dwi'n siŵr mai hi gaiff y wobr. So I'm sure that it is she that will get the prize. So as a VSO language, you'd expect caiff hi, with the subject following the verb, but if you front the subject, then you mark that fact by adding an embedded focus complementizer before it, and that could be my. There are 3 possible forms, at least: my, tau, and na. And so it's the variation there that we're interested in. The standard literary form is my, so it's worth bearing in mind because we get a veneer of my everywhere. Historically, my and tau are both old, go back to Middle Welsh, and na is the innovation. It's not found until the late 19th century. It looks like what happened is that my reduced, so you do find in the Welsh dialect survey the form ma, which looks like it's halfway between my and na. So it kind of looks like what happened is that my became ma and then the M became an N. That's not a sound change. There's nothing regular about that. It's a bit odd. And that suggests you might need to have another hypothesis. And it is possible that there's some influence from the item dyna, there is, which is normally pronounced na as well, or often pronounced na as well. So it may be that there's conflation of the two, and there are possible bridging contexts where that might have been possible. The distribution in the Welsh dialect survey is the one given here, and I've given you the raw data for the Welsh dialect survey. I don't normally do that, but I did that because the raw data is really quite messy, and it's only when you do smoothing on it that you get a nice clear pattern, which is the one on the right. So na is yellow, my is red, and tau is green. And what you see basically is that the central south and southeast is tau. Historically, what must have happened is that the rest of the country was my, and then na is the innovation. It innovates in the northwest, and so you get this kind of crescent pattern, which is the relic area where na has not spread to, right? So my kind of forms a crescent around the na area. And that was the Welsh dialect survey. My own questionnaire work in the syntactic outlets of Welsh dialects produced more or less identical results to the Welsh dialect survey. So we can move swiftly on from that. Let's now look at the Twitter data. Now, I should say there's a word of caution here. It's not quite fully, sorry. It's not quite fully checked, and I think there is a systematic error in overestimating tau. But on the left, you've got the raw data, which isn't so dissimilar to the traditional pattern. And what I'm going to give you is each of them is maps which show the frequency of each of the options. So on the right, you've got it for tau, which seems to show spreading of tau further west than the traditional dialect distribution. I hesitate to make too much of that because, as I emphasize, it needs to be confirmed by more data checking. Compare that to Na. The distribution of Na seems about right for the traditional dialect. And then bearing in mind that this is the standard, we get a kind of veneer of my everywhere. And it may be that's, I mean, it seems to be particularly strong in the Northeast, which is what the traditional dialect surveys suggest. So that distribution isn't inconsistent, but it's interesting that tau appears to be stronger in the south than particularly the southwest, than in the traditional dialect surveys. If that's true, then it's suggesting another form of standardization, I think. A slightly different one, though, going against the literary standards. So, as I said, my is the form in the literary standard. But one possible interpretation of these patterns is the emergence of a kind of a southern spoken standard. Speakers in the south tend to regard tau as a defining feature of southern Welsh, and it looks like it's being adopted throughout the south, even in areas which traditionally don't have it in their local dialect. Okay, so to conclude then, overall, I think the Twitter data are largely successful at establishing plausible distributions, either identical distributions to previous studies, which of course isn't that interesting, but is reassuring, but also some new distributions that seem plausible. And those new distributions give us some possible new insights into the effects of ongoing changes. Above all, some suggestions for what the effects are of revitalization and some associated standardization effects. And also, in the case of the first case study with Khdi, some of the effects of the loss of agreement, which seems to be a wider pattern across various aspects of Welsh inflectional morphology. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Please let's thank our speakers. Our speaker. So let's dive into the question period. I have a couple of questions here. First question I see from Mike Hammond wants to know more about the smoothing.
Actually, Luis, let John have that one. He had the same one, so let him take it.
Okay, so John Powell wants to know about the smoothing algorithm.
So I can clarify it a little bit, and it might relate to Mike's, might be a little bit different. Quick clarification, you use KDE for smoothing, is that correct?
Correct.
First of all, before I even go, I want to say I absolutely loved the presentation. I love the sort of usage of apparent time that you've used in some of your other data as well. But my question regarding KDE, one of the reasons that I really like the KDE method, in addition to sort of the use you were using it for giving values for each of the points, is sort of the use that you can use in the KDE process of producing a raster to, overlaying the area, and I guess in this case would be Wales. And one of the things, I've never done this with KDE, but one of the beauties of KDE that I envision is because it can predict, you can predict values for, you know, an entire continuous surface based on the relative intensity of each point. You could have it even draw isoglosses. And as you're showing that, you know, sort of this myth of isoglosses being these hard lines, KDE can actually show the blending effect. I was curious, one of two questions. First, if you've taken that route, producing a raster overlaying Wales to show those intensities, and if not, maybe if it had something perhaps to do with, I know some of the data you have a lot of data for, some of it you don't have as much data for, if that plays a factor, or anything you have to say about that.
Yeah, we've talked about that, and the decision has been not to create raster interpolations, because so on the, let me go back of the oh, how do I do that? Let me go back. Oh, that. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have done that. We want. So just like take that one. Well, it's I think it's more important if you take one where you don't have so much data. Yeah, so like this one. The reason we haven't done a full interpolation is we want, especially if you haven't got the two together, right? So we don't always show both the raw data and the KDE. So on the smooth data, we want you to be able to see where the points are that we have real data, and where there's a big gap. Because what we were finding, because there's never much data in the east in the middle, because it's sparsely populated and there aren't many Welsh speakers there either. It interpolates there, and it tells you things about non-speakers there, if you like. And we're a bit uneasy about that. You can end up telling a huge story about revitalization in this area until you discover that we actually don't have any data for this, you know, for this big gap here. So that's the reason for taking that decision, and also to make it just a bit clearer to people where the data is coming from, because it's often not evenly distributed across the map, right? That's the nature of the population density. So we just felt it was more honest to do that, and was easier when the people could read the maps. And so we wanted the maps to have clear meanings, right? And actually that's one of the problems with interpolation and smoothing algorithms, is it can be difficult for someone to look at it and say, what does that actually mean? How many people were there? What did they, or how many data points were there? What did those data points show? And I think the more you interpolate, the harder it is to get a sense of that for the viewer.
Thank you.
All right. Second question from Mike about the localization algorithm.
Yeah, so just, again, lovely talk. So localization, it sounds like the method was sort of handcrafted. Is that right?
Define handcrafted.
So, okay, what I would have thought would be some sort of language modeling approach, something like, you know, geolocated these guys, we know where they're from. Geolocate these guys, we know where they're from. Build a language model for each group, right? And then take those models and apply to people you don't know.
Right, but wouldn't that be circular? I mean, that is what people do who aren't interested in linguistics. But if you're then going to use that to do linguistics, or I mean, you're going to end up with a circular method, right? Where you discover that.
I agree. I agree. The risk of circularity, right? But of course, one could. This isn't handcrafting, but one could restrict the language models to variables that are not at issue.
Yeah, I mean, the people who do exactly what you're saying justify it in exactly the way you've said, which is that it was done on the basis of one feature, and now I'm going to investigate another feature. But I think we don't want to go into this saying there are some features we're not going to investigate. We don't, you know, potentially there are loads of features that might be interesting here, and might turn out to be interesting. I mean, there's loads more things you can investigate. So I don't think we want to, rule things out of investigation by doing that. So yeah, the localization algorithm does not use language in any way, and you're quite right. It could use language if the purpose of the algorithm was to work out where people were from, and that was the sole goal of the project. But the goal of the project is actually to do dialect syntax, right? So
good. Fair enough. Good. Thank you.
All right. The next question is from Andrew Zupon, and I'm going to let him ask the question since it's a little bit broad.
Sure. Thanks. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this northeast kind of versus northwest issue. I think Kevin mentioned in the chat as well. For the heathew case, you mentioned we see more heathew in both the northeast and the southeast, possibly due to language revitalization and so on. But for the khdi case, we did often see some khdi in the northeast as well. Could you say a little bit more or hypothesize about why we were seeing the northeast being looking more traditional for the heathew case, but a little more innovative when it came to khdi?
Well, actually, I should say for the heathew case, the north is kind of irrelevant because traditional dialects in the northwest and the northeast have heathew, the standard form. So there's no change. But I think your general question is a fair one, that sometimes what you see is that the East, when it revitalizes, takes on more standard-like features. And that's often been noticed in the schools in both the Northeast and the Southeast, that the kids come out with things which sound too standard to dialect speakers, and that's because the teachers promote those forms. But sometimes you get that kind of standardization effect in the East. And sometimes you get what I've been calling the leapfrogging effect, and you get the leapfrogging effect for other features in the South, actually. So it's not, in the North you seem to get it with khdi. In the South you get it with a feature I haven't talked about here, but I have looked at other times, which is the negative auxiliary, the S negative auxiliary, which is a feature of the Southwest, but not of the traditional Southeastern dialects. And what happens is that it jumps into the Southeast, skipping the intermediate dialects, which are a bit stronger. Now, the question that you're asking boils down to, why do you sometimes get one pattern and why do you sometimes get the other one? Of course, the answer is I don't really know. But I mean, it's about the competing impact. On the one hand, the influence of school and school Welsh, and on the other hand, so another force that we're seeing, which is the sort of emergence of big regional identities linguistically, and a tendency for all the South to go together and all the North to go together, and you sound more northern by adopting features from the Northwest, and you sound more southern by adopting features that are perceived as being as characteristic or as salient markers of the South, and a few things get sort of leapt at. But why? I mean, it boils down to why do some things become salient and other things don't. Some of these things speakers are more aware of than others.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, carrying on. Mike Hammond had a question about when prepositions inflect.
Oh, I think he actually answered that. That was a slide. Basically, what about with khdi? Do you still get the appropriate T forms of the verbs and the prepositions? And you already answered that. So thank you.
All right. And I think Jonas Hynek had a response or a comment. I don't know if he wants to elaborate.
No, that was also a bad response. I have a question further down. May I ask that now? It's a bit different, but do you find information in the Twitter data about the mutation and the loss of nasal and aspirate mutation as well, or is it too written and they do it correctly?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So on your first thing, is it buthy? No, it's not. You have to form it like Mike was, like in Mike's example. So it has to be buthy. On nasal and aspirate mutation, I haven't actually looked at it. My guess would be that you don't find very much nasal or aspirate mutation. Well, nasal mutation is well known to be different depending on what the trigger is. So if the two big triggers for nasal mutation are my and in, nasal mutation with my is stable, nasal mutation with in is not. And I suspect you do get decreased use of it, but we haven't looked. And aspirate mutation, there's been, it's clear that speech has quite low levels of aspirate mutation in all contexts, and I would expect Twitter to have decreased uses, but we haven't looked at it.
Okay, thanks.
All right. John Powell had a question regarding noise.
Yeah, so you mentioned a little bit about noise in a couple of the maps, right? Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. But one of my inclinations is, to what extent some of that might be noise, to what extent could some of it be the embryonic stages of diffusion. Have you been able to either one, rule out that, or two, is it something that you're sort of have you been able to see any even minute trends of increases, especially in the South with Khadi and so forth?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And yeah, of course, one person's noise is another person's embryonic innovation. And that's certainly, there's a bigger deal, I think, in the Northeast where you get to a stage where you think there's just too much noise here. This can't just be noise. But you're right, there is another question, which is particularly in the far south, well, particularly in the most urban areas, so particularly in Cardiff, is there, there's dialect mixing in Cardiff. We know that. We know that people from the north migrate to Cardiff. And anecdotally, there are stories about people, about their kids having very mixed varieties. And so, of course, it's not, and also anecdotally about people from Cardiff being kind of quite, accepting of kind of everything. And of course, that is potentially embryonic stages of language change. But it's very difficult to distinguish from noise and from students. We can't really distinguish, because we can't really tell whether someone in Cardiff is born and bred there or is a student there and they've moved from much further north to be a student. It's hard to know what to do with that. Of course, you can dig deeper into the data, but I think we kind of think it's not really appropriate to look at the data in a more granular way. Of course, you can stalk people, but I don't think we really think it's appropriate to look at individuals. And without doing that, you couldn't really establish whether individuals were born and bred or migrants.
Thank you.
All right. Lastly, we have a comment from Kevin. Says northwest and northeast leapfrogging is a bit like Irish language revivalist, and Belfast looking towards Donegal rather than the Kegan Ifico. Hope I pronounced that right.
Yeah, it's just a sort of comment, but it's quite noticeable that in Belfast you get a lot more Donegal dialect. I suppose it's a more accessible Gaeltacht. It's the nearest accessible Gaeltacht, and as well as that, they're less under the control of Dublin, so they don't have to adhere to the official standard. It's not sharp, but it's.
Yeah, of course, the question is to what extent this is deliberate and to what extent it just emerges from, from convenient practices, right? Because
yeah, I think it's emerging. It's maybe a sort of Valencia versus Barcelona effect. Valencia doesn't want to be under the control of Barcelona, so they make out it's a different language from Catalan.
I mean, I think some of it happens in Wales because the teachers tend to come from the same macro region, right? So the teachers in Cardiff tend to come from further west in the south, and so they sort of import that variety, and also migration patterns. There's quite a lot of migration from the rural areas in the south to Cardiff, and although there's some from the north, there's just less of it. I mean, and if that's what's causing it, it's not really deliberate, but there might be some aspects of it that are deliberate in terms of, like you say, sort of identity formation being different from those other people. Yeah.
Quick thing on the students, can you detect them at all by the time of year, whether it's term time or not?
Yeah, well, I suppose what might happen is COVID sort that out. I mean, the data, none of the data here that I've been showing you is from the COVID time, but we've got most of it. We have got most of the data from the COVID time. The only thing is, because we can't get to the machine, I hope it's still working, but we don't. I'm not in control of the machine. We can obviously log into it remotely, but I think we've got most of the data from the COVID time. So I mean, presumably during most of the COVID time, the students have not been. Most of them anyway have not been in their student university cities. So comparing that time with the previous time would be an interesting thing to do.
All right, this is the end of my questions on my end. If anyone has another question, they can type it in. They can just dive in and ask the speaker.
We have time for one more question. We've actually gone over.
Actually, I had one in the questions. I think you missed it. But it was about, so let me give you a hypothesis or a question. So it's basically whether Twitter data can be taken as a proxy for informal language. And the hypothesis is, hypothetically, that there might be additional complications, like let's say the 140 character limit. So consider the following possibility. Look at the variability that you have with T versus T, which involves a longer thing, versus the auxiliary dropping effect, which involves shortening. And then you look at short tweets versus long tweets. Would you expect, say, with long tweets, less likelihood to use ht because it takes more characters? And less likelihood for ht and less auxiliaries because it shortens things, makes so you can fit more in. You see what I'm saying? Opposite.
I do see what you're saying. You're not the first person to suggest this. Okay. We have, not me, but other members of the team have looked at this hypothesis for English data. They say it doesn't work.
Okay. Damn.
you might think that, but no. The people aren't really thinking, how do I save some extra characters to keep it in? in 140 characters. And indeed now, you know, the limit is higher, so we do get longer tweets. But I don't know, people don't seem to be too bothered by crafting their message, and you can see that with a lot of tweets are pretty throwaway kind of comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for a fantastic talk. Thank you, Louise, for moderating. Thank you to the students for gathering the questions and tech support. And let's thank our speaker one more time.